the party, DOI, on 9 October 2019, which states that, I quote, the strategic objective was to, that is of the coalition, the strategic objective of the coalition was to put an end to self-perpetuating rule by the voluntary acceptance of the coalition-sponsored candidate to serve a 3-year term and preside over a free and fair election in which he or she would not participate or give support to any candidate. Can you please underline in bold, voluntary? DOI is saying that the objective was to put an end to self-perpetuating rule by a voluntary acceptance of the person who was going to be elected as the flag bearer. Now, why sign an agreement where compliance is voluntary? That should have been a gentleman's agreement. In order to sign an agreement, if compliance is voluntary, and that is my argument. In fact, another top coalition member was quoted to say on April 5th that the agreement was a gentleman's agreement, which I also think that was in the case, because the agreement was signed. It means that you give your consent that you will fulfill the obligations of the agreement. Let me hasten to note that nothing was wrong with this clause in the Constitution, that the person to be elected as the flag bearer should resign after 3 years. Nothing is wrong with that. Because why? As in Section 63 of the Constitution, it provides for a 5-year term, while Section 65 of the same Constitution provides for the resignation of the end before the end of the 5-year term. So even though you are elected for 5 years, there is nothing wrong in you resigning after 2 weeks or after 5 years or after 3 years. So nothing was wrong with that provision in the agreement. But it was also the responsibility of the coalition members to hold that person to account. But as we all know, no attempt was made by coalition partners, either individually or collectively, to hold him for account for breach of contract or for breach of agreement. Let's briefly look at the agenda, because removing the incumbent was one goal. The most difficult and most important was to govern, to change this country, change the institutions, reform the institutions. In the coalition manifesto, promises were made. They call it the agenda. The agenda was published, and reforms were promised to be implemented on issues such as education, health, governance, economic reforms, human rights, and justice. Now, some of the promises made in the agenda that were seen to be fundamental for the democratization process were not fully implemented. I'll give examples. Number one, the agenda promised that they will establish a body of jurists and competent personalities to review the Constitution with a view to cleansing it of all provisions which are inimical to democracy and the rule of law. What we saw was not that. What we saw was wholesale change of a constitution by spending $116 million, and it didn't get anywhere. But I would also like to give credit to Honorable who raised this issue in Parliament, but he wasn't listened to. The other promise was that in tune with Section 39 of the 97 Constitution,
2 minutes, Dr. Ceesay. 2 minutes.
2 minutes to go.
Yeah.
Of the 15 minutes?
Yes, sir.
Okay, can I borrow my 2 minutes then?
Yes, you can borrow your first 2 minutes now.
Yeah, so okay, then I'll have to move. But there was an agenda which promised to do certain things. Now let's come to why I think the coalition failed to implement the promises they made. One was leadership. The leadership that was provided during the impasse was not matched when it was needed after the impasse. What we saw was that the architect of the coalition, which is the Honorable, he kind of laid back a bit, and that left the coalition void of leadership. And I think every Gambian wants to even know. I'll take this opportunity to ask Honorable whether he was offered any cabinet post. I think we all want to know that. But also, if he was offered, why didn't he take it? Why did he opt to go to assembly instead of cabinet? Also, I think the coalition failed to defend the coalition members. Why? Because the coalition was undermined by a few people. I'll give examples. One prominent member was in Dakar and said that he had sacked another prominent member who was the spokesperson. He was sacked as the spokesperson. The other one was what? Another prominent member said that the president should go for 5 years instead of 3, and anybody who doesn't like it should go to the courts, and that was not defended by the coalition members. But also, when the first victim of the president, that is the Minister of Interior, was sacked by the president, the coalition members did not challenge the president to say you are violating the principles of the coalition, which is that you must appoint all 5 ministers in consultation.
Into the borrowed 2 minutes now, sir.
Constitutional coalition executive committee, but that wasn't even set up, and there was also no secretariat. So that was also a problem that happened as well. So the coalition was not defended. So we could see from the onset that there were power struggles within the coalition as well. Also, if we were part of the coalition that we would have had the foresight to plan for a legislative governance framework, which was not there. And it brought the argument of tactical alliance and coalition alliance, which rendered parliament almost in a state whereby it was highly polarized. And today we saw what happened, and one of the victims was the constitution. So finally, every Gambian put their trust in the coalition to change this country. That is why we voted. We exchanged our votes for the promise they gave us. And then every Gambian also took part and helped the coalition that led the crusade. Therefore, collectively, we applaud them. But in my opinion, they failed to finish the job, a job that they promised to the Gambian people, and failed to defend and promote the interest of the coalition, and oversights and mistakes led to monumental failures with far-reaching consequences for our democracy. They failed to replace the bad system. They sought to change with a better one, and all the reforms that they promised either were not initiated or they failed. And all members are responsible for this failure in my argument. To move on and to have trust from the population, I think members should acknowledge that there were shortcomings, accept it, accept the weaknesses, take collective responsibility. That is what leaders do. When there is success, they give credit. When there is failure or weakness, they come out and take responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ismaila Ceesay, Citizens Alliance Political Party. Now, Honorable Halifa Sallah will have an opportunity to respond in his view if, in fact, Coalition 2016 have failed the Gambian people, or was the success it was designed to be. Honorable Sallah, the floor is yours.
Every analysis must take context into consideration. You must have the point at issue, interrogate it, gather the evidence in order to pass judgment. Unfortunately, and maybe the Honorable Dr. Ceesay will clear that point, I don't think he has ever read even the coalition agreement. I may be wrong. But his premise will either indicate that he has not read it or does not want to fully explain its essence. The context. Here is a document called Opposition Parties' Proposals and Demands for Electoral and Constitutional Reform in the Gambia, 7 April 2015. This was sent to the President, to ECOWAS, to all international organizations. After that, on the 20th of July, 2015, the executive came with this act to amend the Elections Act. And Section 43 decided to increase the deposits to 500,000 from 10,000 for presidential candidates, 50,000 against 5,000 for National Assembly members, 50,000 against 2,500 for mayors and chairpersons, and then 10,000 against 1,250 for councillors. 48 constituencies multiplied by the 50,000. You can see that there was a deliberate attempt to make it impossible for the opposition to survive. And I will not mention the other additives. So the response of the executive was that it will not engage in electoral reform. What followed? All of you are witnesses to what Doi proposed in 2015, if proper research has been done. We indicated in our agenda 2016, published in 2015. And here I will be willing to give it to Honorable Dr. Ceesay, where it talks about strategy for 2016. The agenda analyzed that it was the deliberate attempt of the government to frustrate the opposition. And the opposition responded in 2012 by not participating in the elections, National Assembly elections, unless there was electoral reform. The presidential election indicated very clearly that the opposition could not remove the government from office by each political party being on its own. The result, 17% for UDP, 11% for the United Front. That was the result of the presidential election. The vote of the UDP was declining. Of course, the United Front was rising, but together is just 27%, which is what the UDP had in the 2006 presidential election. So we saw electoral reform to be absolute must. We called for it. We refused to participate unless it was done in 2012. And Doi analyzed the results of the 2012 National Assembly elections, where you had 48 seats, only 23 seats were contested. And out of those seats, you had result 80,000 for the APRC and 60,000 for the independent. Plus the 14,000 NRP, you had only a difference of less than 7,000. Showing that the APRC, regarding the popular vote, did not have that full control of the population, especially when we took into consideration that over 790-something thousand were supposed to participate, only 23 constituencies participated, numbering about 300-something thousand, and out of those 300-something thousand, only 150-something thousand participated in the National Assembly elections. We had 5 people who were not APRC, 4 independent, 1 NRP. So moving forward, Doi analyzed that if we are to participate in the 2016 election, we must insist on electoral reform, failing which we must build a coalition. So essentially, that is history. Now, looking at the coalition, in September, I was elected as a presidential candidate. We saw the temperature. The leader of the UDP was in prison. Gambians abroad felt that there was no way of changing this country except to overthrow the government. The government had decided that it is the power of the state that will protect it, because as far as electoral contest was concerned, it was going to win, hands down. It was not threatened by any opposition. The temperature was rising, and DOI saw the need to implement its tactical objective, to try to build a coalition. I convened a meeting at Kairaba Hotel deliberately, because any other place the government was suspicious of meetings of the opposition. And it would have been very easy, wherever the opposition met, to say, well, they are preparing for something else other than election. Because the person who was in power never believed that no right-thinking opposition would ever think that you can remove him through the ballot box. I knew very clearly that he will know everything that is happening at Kairaba. And by virtue of that, he will simply say, well, these people, leave them. That was the Achilles heel. Leave them. And we met. The beginning was not a coalition of parties. It was a coalition of the presidential candidates, and then involved their parties. 6 presidential candidates were ready to participate. For the sake of time, we all know them. We convened the meeting. Only 2 sent the presidential candidates. Rest sent their representatives. For 2 weeks, the discussion continued, until we saw an opening. Eventually, a group calling itself Inter-Party Committee met me and indicated that, well, they were interested in what was happening at Kairaba. It was very clear then that they could also be incorporated in the discussion. Another woman, I do not need to mention names, also had always been writing to the opposition parties for coalition. We saw the need to involve the woman in the second phase. And finally, I contacted Honorable Dembo Boja to emphasize the need for the organization we have established, the opposition parties for GOFA, that is opposition parties for electoral reform. Opposition parties for electoral reform, GOFA, to convene a meeting of all the members so that we can start the process of coalition building. That was done. We had these independent civil society representatives to participate. But ultimately, the answer to your question is this. The coalition started the process of being built on the 14th of October. We met on the 17th to prepare the agreement. You will question me about the agreement. I will show you what is there. All it mentioned is that we agreed to put the past behind us and come together to be able to have delegates, 10 representatives, in order to have a coalition building process. What was mentioned in the agreement is that we will have a committee on good governance, committee on national convention, committee on democracy and rule of law, committee on justice and human rights. We had committees. The committees met, made recommendations. We adopted the recommendation. These 3 years that you've mentioned became part of those recommendations. We participated in elections with the view to prevent the deterioration of the peace of the country. Insults everywhere. attacks everywhere. Gambia was in flames. We all know it. So the purpose of the coalition was to ensure that we bring about a change that will prevent Gambia from disintegration. That was the fundamental objective. The other objectives are collateral objectives, but the key objective was to ensure that we prevent Gambia from disintegration. And that succeeded. On the 30th of October, we selected a presidential candidate. I was a presidential aspirant. Why did I accept? Because failure to accept, the incumbent would have still been there. That would not have been a way of attaining our objectives. We decided to campaign on a platform of one Gambia, one nation, one people. And the coalition succeeded before the vast majority of people even knew what was in a manifesto. The Gambian people supported the coalition because they were convinced that where Gambia was heading will lead to disintegration.
2 minutes, Honorable Salah.
So in that respect, if we look at context, there is not a single Gambian here who would say that before October 30th, he or she believed that change will come through the ballot box on the 1st of December 2016. Not a single Gambian other than those who had the tactical objectives of building a coalition. So I must say that in that respect, for the country to change through the ballot box for the first time in its history, 52 years of history, nobody can say that the coalition did not attain the objective for which it was established. Now we must go, and through the question that will be asked, into the context of nation building after the victory. Why did it take the shape that it did? 25th of December, prior to taking over on the 19th, we established the fact that the constitutional legitimacy was the primary objective to be defended. Electoral legitimacy, primary objective to be defended. We defended that through the impasse and stabilized the country and ensure a change of power through peaceful means. That is the second attainment of the strategic objective of the coalition, to ensure transfer of power through peaceful means. On the 19th, the president assumed office. On the 24th...
Time, Honorable.
Can I borrow 2 minutes and conclude?
Yes, you can borrow your first 2 minutes as well.
So in that sense, then, we have seen that trajectory of a country changing without any looting, without any killing, without any war, no invasion by ECOMIG. They were received as forces of solidarity rather than force of invasion, as we have seen in 1981. Who on earth would say that the coalition failed in that respect? So all the objectives for which the coalition was established were actually attained. And finally, we had to go to the second stage, where the coalition needed another memorandum of understanding, which it never signed. If you want to know why it wasn't signed and the implications, the contradiction within the coalition, I believe that is what we are here to interrogate. But as far as fundamental objective is concerned, the coalition led the Gambia to change office to the ballot box in peace.
Thank you very much, Honorable Salah. We have gone through the first part. I'd like to introduce Keba Kamara of Keba Kacha and Keba Kamara Kabefo, so that members of the press here present, please, you can go through Keba because he will be moderating the question and answer. Not yet, sir, not yet. But he'll be moderating the question and answer session with the press. So Adama, please provide him a microphone as well.